Welcome. On this January morning, we gather virtually across the country to celebrate the 23rd annual MLK celebration and the 93rd birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a keynote address at the Lincoln Memorial during a prayer pilgrimage for freedom entitled, "Give Us the Ballot, We Will Transform the South." In his address, Dr. King Jr. remarks that the 1954 Supreme Court decision, quote, came as a beacon of light of hope to millions, unquote. And yet, this noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition, using, quote, all types of conniving methods to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, unquote. In 2022, Dr. King's analysis is worthy of reflection as lawsuits across the nation challenge the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Once again, the American doctrine of freedom and equality for all people is in jeopardy. Let us begin this morning with the African American National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Now, join me as I welcome our conductor and the visionary of this great day, Dr. Roland Carter.
Sing. David, come on.
Our program begins with ALA President Patty Wong. Patty is the city librarian at Santa Clara City Library. She is the former city librarian at Santa Monica Public Library and is former director of library services for Yolo County Library, California. She also serves part-time on the faculty at the San Jose State University High School. She started her career as a children's librarian at Oakland Public Library. Patty is the recipient of several awards, including the 2012 ALA Equality Award, CALA Distinguished Service Award 2014, and Member of the Year, California Library Association in 2012. She holds a BA in Women's Studies and an MLS, both from the University of California at Berkeley. Please welcome Patty Wong.
Dr. King opened his 1957 address with these words. 3 years ago, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision which will long be stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. For all men of goodwill, this May 17 decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of enforced segregation. It came as a legal and sociological death blow to the old Plessy doctrine of separate but equal.
King continued in his address. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with words of interposition and nullification. Methods of defiance range from crippling economic reprisals to the tragic reign of violence and terror to make for massive resistance.
But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic traditions, and it is democracy turned upside down.
So long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen, observing the laws I have helped to enact. I can only submit to the edict of others.
So our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights.
Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will be the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the southern states, and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence.
Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice.
Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy, and will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine.
Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and non-violently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954. In this junction of our nation's history, there is an urgent need for dedicated and courageous leadership. If we are to solve the problems ahead and make racial justice a reality, this leadership must be fourfold.
For strong, aggressive leadership from the federal government. If the executive and legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizenship rights as the federal courts have been, then the transition from a segregated to an integrated society would be infinitely smoother.
In the midst of the tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of this government is all too silent and apathetic. In the midst of the desperate need for civil rights legislation, the legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical.
Both parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing reactionary Northerners.
In the midst of these prevailing conditions, we come to Washington today pleading with the President and the members of Congress to provide a strong, moral, and courageous leadership for a situation that cannot permanently be evaded. We come humbly to say that the civil rights issue is not an ephemeral, evanescent domestic issue. It is rather an eternal moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our nation.
A second area in which there's a need for strong leadership is from the white Northern liberals. There's a dire need today for liberalism, which is truly liberal. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side. It is a liberalism that is so objectively analytical that it is neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm.
We call for a liberalism from the North, which will be thoroughly dedicated to the ideal of racial justice and will not be deterred by the propaganda and subtle words of those who say, "Slow up for a while, you are pushing too fast."
At this time, we welcome our featured keynote speaker, Keisha N. Blaine. Keisha N. Blaine is a historian of the 20th century United States, specializing in African American history, the modern African diaspora, and women's and gender studies. She is the author of the multi-prize winning book, Set the World on Fire, and co-editor with Ibram X. Kendi of the #1 New York Times bestseller, 400 Souls. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, president of the African American Intellectual History Society, and a columnist for MSNBC. Follow her at KeishaBlaine.com, on Twitter at Keisha Blaine, and on Instagram at Keisha N. Blaine. Please welcome at this time, Keisha N. Blaine.
In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech on the power of voting. King argued that access to the ballot would allow Black Americans to remake society without having to wait for federal support. He argued that voting was a solution for the many challenges that Black Americans faced. King's speech also addressed the 1954 Brown decision. In the aftermath of Brown, local school districts and politicians continued to resist the attempts to desegregate schools nationwide. These delays frustrated civil rights activists across the nation who organized the prayer pilgrimage for freedom. King used his speech at the event to advocate for expanding Black political rights. He emphasized the need for strong leadership to emerge from several groups, including from within Black communities. King called for courageous Black leaders to emerge. He stated that these leaders must meet hate with love. King's vision would soon be realized as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and later the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, spread throughout the South. SNCC recruited local Black leaders to organize their communities. These leaders were essential to achieving the victories of the Civil Rights Movement, and perhaps none more so than Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was the embodiment of King's vision, a courageous leader who answered the call to expand Black political rights. Hamer deeply believed in the power of voting. Although King and Hamer did not always see eye to eye, she shared his commitment that the politics of love could overcome the politics of hate. Born in Mississippi in 1917, Hamer was a working poor and disabled Black sharecropper who joined the Civil Rights Movement at the age of 44. In 1962, her life changed dramatically after attending a mass meeting at a local church. The gathering had been organized by activists in SNCC. The speakers that night highlighted how ordinary citizens could transform American society with the right to vote, a message that resonated with Hamer. She went on to become a field secretary for SNCC and assisted Black people in Mississippi and beyond with voter registration. This was dangerous work. In June 1963, Hamer was returning from South Carolina with a group of other activists. They stopped in Winona to grab a bite to eat. Hamer's colleagues encountered resistance from the owners of the cafe, who made it clear that Black people were not welcomed. The police arrived, and when Hamer exited the bus, an officer grabbed her and started kicking her. After Hamer and her colleagues were arrested, they received brutal beatings from the police officers, who also instructed prisoners to do the same. Hamer's injuries left her with kidney damage, a blood clot in her eye, and worsened a physical limp that she would carry for the rest of her life. However, Hamer was undeterred and continued her efforts to expand Black political rights. This was no small matter. Despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Black people in the South were still shut out of the formal political process. During the early 1960s, only an estimated 5% of Mississippi's 450,000 Black residents were registered to vote. Hamer was determined to change this. In April 1964, she joined forces with several other activists to establish the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP. The group challenged the Mississippi all-white Democratic Party. In August of 1964, only months after the establishment of MFDP, Hamer and others traveled to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to attend the Democratic National Convention. The group arrived in Atlantic City, hoping to compel the state and national party to give up seats to the MFDP delegation rather than suffering the embarrassment of exposing the lack of equal representation before a national audience. They also hoped to raise awareness to the broader struggles that Black people in Mississippi face as they attempted to exercise their right to vote. They wanted people to know about the resistance civil rights activists encountered while organizing in the state. The experience in Atlantic City transformed Hamer. Although she encountered resistance, she persisted and delivered the most well-known speech of her political career before the Credentials Committee at the convention. Hamer used her speech to describe the acts of racist violence Black people faced on a daily basis in the Jim Crow South. She told the stories of shots being fired at the homes of those who supported voting rights. And she told the story of what happened to her in Winona. As she reflected on the painful experiences that Black people face in the South, Hamer could not help but to question America. In her words, "Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" These crucial words shook the nation to its core. The United States could not claim to be a democracy while withholding voting rights from millions of its citizens. Hamer had asked an urgent question that all Americans were forced to ponder: is this America? If Americans claimed to be committed to the ideals of liberty and justice for all, then Hamer's testimony laid bare the full extent of American hypocrisy. The Democratic Party ultimately attempted to make the problem go away by trying to convince the MFDP to accept a compromise. They offered 2 non-voting seats. The 2-seat offer was a symbolic gesture that lacked any influence or actual representation. As a result, Hamer passionately refused to compromise. She did not know it immediately, but the speech had electrified the nation. Thousands were moved to act because of Hamer's powerful testimony. Martin Luther King Jr. later praised Hamer and the other members of the delegation. Though he favored taking the compromise from the National Democratic Party, King also understood Hamer's decision, and he thanked Hamer and her colleagues for bringing the political powers to their knees in repentance. Hamer's passionate speech, combined with the nationwide protests, compelled President Lyndon B. Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The act implemented restrictions on how states could enforce new election laws. These provisions overturned decades of restrictive policies that had kept Black people away from the ballot box. The Voting Rights Act significantly bolstered Black political participation. In Mississippi alone, the number of African Americans registered to vote dramatically increased from 28,000 to approximately 280,000. In the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act, the number of Black elected officials in the South more than doubled. The Voting Rights Act has been under attack since its passage. Over the last decade, a number of state and local laws have worked in tandem to curtail Black voting rights. The Shelby Supreme Court ruling of 2013 effectively undermined the use of preclearance by federal courts and the Department of Justice for changes to state voting laws. Several state and local authorities have taken advantage of this development to chip away at Black voting rights. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 19 states passed 33 laws that restricted voting access this year, with more than 445 bills introduced for that purpose in 49 states. These developments serve as a bitter reminder that the fight for voting rights is far from over. Now more than ever, we must look to courageous Black leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King Jr., who believed that all Americans, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, and ability, should have full and equal access to the vote, the most fundamental right of every citizen. Fannie Lou Hamer reinforced this point throughout the 1960s to anyone who would listen, as she often pointed out, it has to be with the people, for the people, and by the people. Indeed, there is no democracy without equal protection and equal access for all. Thank you for listening.
Dr. King continued in his 1957 address. A third area that we must look to for strong leadership is from the moderates of the White South. It is unfortunate leaders of the White South stems from closed-minded reactionaries. These persons gain prominence and power by the dissemination of false ideas and by deliberately appealing to the deepest hate responses within the human mind.
It is my firm belief that this closed-minded, reactionary, recalcitrant group constitutes a numerical minority. There are in the White South more open-minded moderates. These persons silent today because of the fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. God grant that the white moderates of the South will rise up courageously, without fear, and take up the leadership in this tense period of transition.
We cannot close without stressing the urgent need for strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership from the Negro community. We need leadership that is calm and yet positive. We are grappling with such a complex problem, there is no place for misguided emotionalism. We must work passionately and unrelentingly for the goal of freedom, but we must be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. We must never struggle with falsehood, hate, or malice.
There's another warning signal. We talk a great deal about our rights, and rightfully so. We proudly proclaim that 3/4 of the peoples of the world are colored. We have the privilege of noticing in our generation the great drama of freedom and independence as it unfolds in Asia and Africa. All of these are in line with the unfolding work of Providence.
We must not seek to use our emerging freedom and our growing power to do the same thing to the white minority that has been done to us for so many centuries. We must not become victimized with the philosophy of Black supremacy. Our aim must never be to defeat or to humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding, and thereby create a society in which all men will be able to live together as brothers.
We must also avoid the temptation of being victimized with the psychology of victors. In our nation, under the guidance of the superb legal counsel of the NAACP, we have been able, through the courts, to remove the legal basis of segregation.
This is by far the most marvelous achievement of our generation. Every person of goodwill is profoundly indebted to the NAACP for its noble work. We must not, however, remain satisfied with a court victory over our white brothers.
We must respond to every decision with an understanding of those who have opposed us and with an appreciation of the difficult adjustments that the court orders pose for them.
We must act in such a way as to make possible a coming together of white people and colored people on the basis of a real harmony of interest and understanding. We must seek an integration based on mutual respect.
I conclude by saying that each of us must keep faith in the future. Let us realize that as we struggle alone, God struggles with us. He is leading us out of a bewildering Egypt through a bleak and desolate wilderness toward a bright and glittering promised land. Let us go forth into the glorious future with the words of James Welton Johnson resounding in our souls.
God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray.
Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce and welcome our call to action speaker, ALA Executive Director Tracy D. Hall.
Dr. King often used the attribution beloved community, and it feels fitting that I use it here as I address ALA's members and stakeholders. And so I begin. Beloved community, as I reflect on the connection Dr. King makes between voting access and political transformation when he says, "Give us the ballot, we will transform the South," I am reminded that the activism the young, not yet, and never to be 40-year-old minister envisioned began with insistence and resistance, but ended in action and responsibility. I cannot help but transfer that thinking, that framework to the library and information services sector, where we face a community of readers and learners that depend on us to advocate for their needs through our practices, protocols, programs, and the policies we shape and accept. Though not every library and information professional might envision themselves an activist, it is critical that we understand that both our individual and collective work contributes to how libraries and information environments are viewed and experienced as a system. And those systems are built on relationships. Lauded Detroit activist and author Grace Lee Boggs once reflected that our long-term effect on people and systems often occurs not as monumental campaigns, but as a result of small actions and activities through what she called, quote, the invisible fabric of our connectedness. Lee Boggs reminds us that in, and I quote, this exquisitely connected world, it's never a question of critical mass. It's always about critical connections. In an era where our primary quality of life indicators, access to education, access to employment, and access to public health are increasingly predicated on digital access, libraries are and must be deeply vested in ensuring the greatest level of connectivity for their users. This is a critical area of focus for the American Library Association and for the LIS sector at large, especially as this past year has exposed a number of digital access barriers, such as expensive and low quality broadband, the ongoing paucity of technology devices in the lowest income households, and the overlap of limited reading and digital literacy skills. Left unchecked, any of these barriers can impede socioeconomic mobility and agency for individuals and communities in the aggregate. At ALA, this desire to forge a deeper sense of connectedness to the libraries, practitioners, and users that rely on our advocacy and technical assistance has inspired the development of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Scorecard for library and information organizations, developed by our own Committee on Diversity to hold a mirror up to ALA and libraries everywhere, as well as an ever-increasing number of new platforms, services, and grants intended to grow the capacity of libraries to meet community need. But even more than a web of programs and services, we, as a community, must begin to see our membership itself as a movement committed to education, to access, to intellectual freedom, to equity, to sustainability, and other essential core values. Values that connect us and that we all contribute to realizing as a body. Even as we seek to call out inequity, we must also commit to calling ourselves, each other, in to do the work of building and repair. Lee Boggs asserted, "I've come to believe that you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it." We are responsible for creating that sense of belonging that leads to deep systemic change. I look forward to working alongside you in that movement. Thank you.
Thank you to the American Library Association for this commemorative event this year. Thank you to all of you for your virtual presence wherever you are today. A special thank you to Monica Chapman and the Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services for your invaluable assistance coordinating this virtual gathering. A special thank you to OCLC for their continuous support of this event, both in person and virtually, the Social Responsibilities Roundtable, the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, Beacon Press Incorporated, our guest speaker, Keisha Blaine, our call to action speaker, Tracy D. Hall, and to my co-chair, LaJuan Pringle. Peace and blessings to all of you until next year. And now for our closing song, We Shall Overcome, virtually sung by the Easter Hill United Methodist Church Choir from North Decatur, Georgia.
I